So this first section is why we're here. You might be here voluntarily, you might be here because someone's told you have to come and listen to it, but you have probably been told that this is a method of improving outcomes in education, which is quite reliable, quite straightforward. If you can articulate to your team and the people around you what your methodology of delivering change is going to be and how it's going to feel, what outcomes you're trying to achieve, and the sort of good rigor and clarity behind the approach, it's much easier to not only gain buy-in for doing the project that you're trying to do, but also to make sure that people are aware of how you're going to go about it. That's particularly important in education because even just clarity of defining what the problem is hard to do. There are more variables, there's less time, there's more complexity in education than in any other part of the world. And so narrowing down the scope of what it is that you're going to improve and being rigorous about how you go about it is both very complicated to do, but if you get it right, can yield a massive amount of value because the pace and drive that can then sit behind it is really well targeted. So this section is what is balanced improvement. I think about it as making sure that we're managing our time and energy effectively. And I think that is particularly important and difficult in education, where you can spend your time almost endlessly on any different element of education. And it's pretty hard to know whether you're doing that most effectively or not. But yet, time is at a premium more in education than almost anywhere else in the world, and because there is so little of it available. And so I was asked to come and support a trust with this type of work a few years ago, and we started out by asking a series of questions, and the answers to those questions have become the balanced improvement methodology. So the first questions, which actually took quite a long time to answer, was what is it that we're aiming to do? And that was a difficult question to answer because although in general we all felt like we were aligned on what it was that we were trying to do, we talked about it in slightly different ways, we categorized it in slightly different ways, and we also couldn't answer the next question very succinctly, which was how do we know how we're doing? Now, in some areas of running a school or in some areas of in education, what is it that we aim to do and how do we know how we are doing are very complicated questions to answer. And it's unusual that you get a large group of people who've got an absolutely shared taxonomy, frame of reference, scale of measure for all of the different complex elements, even within one element of running a school, like teaching and learning, for example, absolute clarity on the two or three things that we're aiming to do, how we measure that, and how are we doing against it is complex. So that became the first part, which we'd call the toolkit. So what is it that we aim to do and how do we know how we are doing? Pulling that together across a multi-academy trust or across a region is coming, pulling it together across a school is hard. So that's the first part of it, the sort of toolkit to let us know the answers to those two questions. The second part is once we're clear on what our areas of responsibility are, what we're aiming to do and how we're doing, the next question is what should we improve next? And the reason that's complicated is it's because it's by definition a subjective decision. And so we needed to have a piece of methodology. And in the past, I've used a sort of ease and value grid to get alignment from the senior team, whether it's in a school or in a trust, or within a subject, within any area where there are multiple subjective views led by experts on the value of, if you've got three different areas that you could work on, you might all have different takes on if we move area one forward by an increment and we invest our time there, I think that's the best thing to do because of XYZ reasons. The next person might think it's area B that we should be focusing on. So putting a structure around that process. So whatever it is that you arrive at, you've got a sense of unity behind what are the one or two things that we're going to prioritize. It's a cliche because it's true, but if everything's a priority, nothing's a priority. So you've got a clear way of saying, what are we going to work on next and what comes after? So that's the ease and value part of the balanced improvement process, or the sort of prioritization part. And then the final part of it is once you've decided what it is that you're going to focus on, how can we most effectively improve it? And are we getting better at that process of improvement? And there's a lot more detail in this in the next sections of the video, but having a proper sort of understand or assess phase, a really good design phase, co-design phase, before you move into implementation and sustainability is really important. So I'll describe what those different stages are, the key differentiators that make it work every time instead of some of the time, and then also how you become better at it. So how you do a sort of bronze level version of that, a silver level, and then a gold level of that sort of rigorous improvement process. One of the questions that you might have is what has happened where people have used this before? So what's the benefit and what's the disbenefit? One way of thinking about it would be almost trying to argue the opposite of going through this approach, which would be there isn't a structured way of guiding a team through problem definition. We don't try something out before we roll it out everywhere, and we don't get buy-in and do co-design on the way, or that we start trying to solve the problem before we've actually identified what are the biggest root causes. It's quite hard to argue the opposite. The other way of doing it is to talk about programs where schools have found this a useful approach. And what is interesting is the range of things that have been used. So from understanding and improving on the root causes of attendance, to increasing parental engagement, on helping with homework, to splitting out what are the causes of poor written language, whether they're almost like means motive opportunity, to assessing the effectiveness of interventions on language development. It's a sort of pretty systematic way of approaching anything like that. The schools have fed back so far that the shared ownership of the outcomes, clarity that we're going to be focusing on the top one or two things that are causing us the problem, and knowing that there's something that's a reliable and rigorous process means that you spend less time on things that don't work or aren't working as well as they could. And even if, when you get part way through and things don't work as you expected, you've still got a whole team aligned on the logic, and you're going back and testing what your logic is to make sure that's solid, rather than having expended a huge amount of effort on trying to roll something out like a whole behavior policy or culture policy, when actually the problem was a smaller group or a smaller subset of that big problem. So the feedback so far has been guaranteed results in whatever the domain is. And actually, even though it takes a little bit more time to get your head around things, the fact that you're able to rigorously cut through the noise, solve one problem and move on to the next has made it a much more effective way of getting things done.
Whatever it is we're looking at, that is enabling us to think more creatively about solutions, which enable us to put in strategies that have a bigger impact than we'd realised. Getting down to the nitty-gritty of what's the individual needs to make that difference. And I think that's the power of balanced improvement. You do think the strategy has got to be broad, but actually the power of bringing it into a sharp focus is phenomenal. I can't say phenomenal, but it has had a big